Last month, New York State Assembly moved on wage inequality and passed a bill requiring government contractors to regularly file public reports detailing their employees' pay averages by job category, race, gender, and ethnicity. Now, some of the bill's supporters, however, are all talk, no action when it comes to their own offices, according to journalist Matthew Thomas. Progressive Assemblywoman Yuli New of Chinatown pays most of her full-time staff a measly $30,000 a year. She also tweets weird things about how everything is violence, but that was a different story. While 30-year veteran Assemblywoman Deborah Glick of Tribeca and the West Village pays her white employees over 4 times more on average than her Hispanic staff, allegedly.
So author of the Vulgar Marxism newsletter, Matt Thomas, joins us now to expand on his reporting. Welcome back to Rising.
You're having me.
And so first things first, to set the context, do these staffers live in New York City or do they live in Albany? Because that actually is, $30,000 in Albany and $30,000 in New York City are two different things. Not that you're living high on the hog in Albany, but you're at least not dying.
So the personal staffs of the elected representatives live wherever they are from. There are central staff in Albany that live there, but those are different than the ones that are analyzed in the article. So the personal staff for people that serve in both the Assembly and the Senate live in the districts where their representatives are elected.
Right, so that's New York City. So.
Right. Yeah. Everyone in the article here is analyzed is in the context of New York City for an apples to apples comparison.
$30,000 doesn't go very far.
They do. What are these? Are these rich donor kids? Like, how are they getting by? Like, what's your sense of how they get by on $30,000 a year in New York City?
Well, that's definitely one of the problems because pay is so low. A lot of these jobs, essentially become internships for people from families that are already well off. You see that in media as well. The pay is so low at the lowest level that only people who come from money or who have some other means of supporting themselves are able to actually do these kinds of jobs. I'm always a little puzzled about how people say, how can you get by on like $30,000 a year in New York City? Like, there are a lot of poor people in New York City. I've been a poor person in New York City. So you can definitely do it. It's not fun. It's awful. It sucks to be poor. But you can definitely make it happen. And of course, millions of people do every day in New York. But it's preposterous that, the people that control, the government and that promote progressive values and things like pay equity would force their own employees to live on $30,000 a year and really be in poverty in New York City.
I actually did it myself in my early 20s, and the answer to that was lucking out with an incredible rent controlled apartment and just never doing anything. Like eating the cheapest stuff out of the grocery store and social life, bringing beer to people's houses. Like you could not do anything other than that. And then you could make it.
Yeah. And I take your point about hypocrisy, obviously, if you're a legislator who's advocating, higher minimum pay, that sort of thing, but you pay your workers terribly. I mean, clean hit, obviously hypocritical. That said, I guess my concern would be if you were to advocate having some sort of mandatory minimum pay that's much higher than this, is that you would price out actually younger people who want to get their start in politics or journalism. Same thing if there's a minimum salary requirement. The staffer just wouldn't, or the congressperson just was not willing to pay $50,000 for a kid who's just out of college who you have no idea how good of a staffer they are. You are willing to pay $30,000. If you have to pay them $50,000, you're just not going to hire any of these people. I guess that would be my concern.
I think that the incentives are somewhat different in the public sector versus the private sector. So the way it works in New York is that, at least in in both the state assembly and the state senate, the leadership of each body assigns a certain amount of money to each elected to hire staff, and it's seniority based. And so if you've been there, if it's your first term or even in your first, honestly, 10 years of service, you get a certain amount. The minimum amount for Democrats at the lowest rung in the New York State Assembly for staff is like 180, 190,000. And they give that to you and they say, hire whoever you want, however you want. So you can hire 3 full-time people and 1 part-time person. You can hire 3 full-time people and 10 part-time people, like however you want to break that down, you can do it. And so, but it's not as though that money is going for any other use. Like in the private sector, people, employers may not want to pay a certain amount for a certain type of labor because they need that money for other operations of the business. But an elected representative, like their staff allocation is just their staff allocation. And honestly, like it's a drop in a bucket compared to the $200 billion a year budget of the state of New York. So I think the incentives are somewhat different. There's not the incentive on the part of the elected to save that money or reinvest it somewhere else like there would be in the private sector.
Well, then, so in that case, does this, legislator who only pays $30,000, does that mean she has like a giant staff or something? Like she's paying a bunch of people a small amount of money?
Yes, that's exactly what it means. So like if you look at the breakdown of Assemblymember Yulia New's staff, I think she has 3 or 4 full-time people at the absolute lowest rung you can possibly pay. I think her legislative director makes like $29,500 a year. She has 2 or 3 people at $30,000 a year. I think the chief of staff makes around 50, and then she has like 4 or 5 people making between like 10 and 12 or 15 a year that are allegedly part-time doing various roles. That's an unusually high number of people. That's the most people employed at any one time of all the assembly members' staffing records that I reviewed. Most of for example, my former boss, Zarhan Mamdani, who represents Astoria in the state assembly, he has 3 full-time people on staff and 1 part-time person. And each of them make, I believe, between 50 and 60 a year, except for the part-time person who I forget how much she makes. But so you can structure it in different ways. But yeah, there's a strategy, obviously, of the more, like you can have a larger staff that is less well compensated, but then you can sort of pressure them, like once they're already in the office, you can be like, well, you're already here, can you stay an hour extra? And so by breaking it up and having a larger staff, I think it's easier to pressure people to get the most, sort of bang for your buck out of how much you're paying them.
This explains where that ridiculously dumb tweet comes from. She doesn't have anyone competent, well-paid working staff for her to say, wait a minute, stop.
And are the part-time staff connected to the fact that the assembly only meets for part of the year? Is that your sense?
No, the assembly is only in session about 6 months out of the year, but the work that the electeds do is full-time, or it's supposed to be full-time. In New York, there's this expectation that constituent services are offered by each office year-round, and of course they do other types of, I guess it depends on the elected. Many electeds that are good at their jobs and dedicated do organizing year-round full-time, so they may do tenant organizing, they'll provide constituent services, they'll work on other political projects, they'll build support for initiatives or bills that they want to pass. So they do work full-time, and the staff is supposed to be hired full-time as well. There's a certain category of staff that are hired only for the legislative session, but all of the full-time staffers discussed in the article are supposed to be year-round.
It creates an interesting dilemma because you can step back and say the entire system is gross and needs to be reformed. But if you're one member in that system, you're faced with curious choices. If constituent service, is as significant a part of the job as you're saying, which I agree that it is, then in some ways, the more that you can exploit these workers, the better your constituent service is going to be. So it's not, you're not exploiting workers just to, make sure the prime shows up the next day. You're keeping people in their homes. You're making sure that people are getting the benefits they need. You're saving lives and making people's lives better. So it does create an interesting kind of ethical trade-off there. How do most members grapple with that? Because if you were like, my main concern is pay equity. I'm going to have 2 full-time staff. They're going to be paid very well. Then you might not be able to serve your constituents as well. Or you might be able to serve them better because you get super qualified people that are then able to organize the neighborhood. I don't know. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I think that, that is the tension that is created by kind of the level of artificial scarcity. Certainly, you could invest a huge amount of money. You could give each staff member $1 million, or each elected official $1 million to hire their staff, but that would probably be too much. Yeah, you do. There's always that trade-off, and I think you see the same dynamic in political campaigns, especially on the left. There was a big blow up last year around the mayoral campaign of a leftist candidate, Diane Morales, about how the staff should be treated and whether or not they were being asked to do too much. That was a complicated case, but you see the same dynamic across progressive campaigns, especially in the push for the unionization of progressive campaign staff. The tension there is you want to ensure that the people that are working on the campaign are well treated and well compensated. But at the same time, on the left, we don't have a ton of money to throw around. And there is sort of an imperative to give to the movement in a way that is not a nickel and diming it so much, recognizing that it's not just a job, it's about a dedication to a cause. And I think the same dynamic is present in something like constituent services or working for an elected. And so it's difficult to strike that balance sometimes, but it's much easier if there isn't this kind of artificial scarcity imposed from outside. And I think that the seniority-based allocation system in the state assembly is definitely amplifying those contradictions.
Well, Matthew Thomas, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.